Hello YouTube. This video is going to be my fourth and final installment in my Scandi series. In this video we're going to be covering, instead of the move queen takes d5, we're going to be covering the move knight to f6. And once again, if you like my content, please go ahead and subscribe to my channel, and I'll go ahead and keep the content coming. So when I started thinking about how to approach the advice that I was going to give against the move knight f6, I really had to do a little bit of soul searching, and I had to decide whether or not I was going to just show some of today's modern main lines and give you the lines that today's top players play, or if I was going to show you a couple of maybe novel ideas on how to approach this position with white, that are lesser explored, but I think definitely deserve attention. And I've decided to go with the latter. I'm going to show you a few novel ideas that I think white should try in these positions, even though I don't think there's anything at all wrong with the absolute main lines in these positions. I think they're perfectly okay. So, and before I go any further, I want to give credit to some of these main lines where credit is due. I mean, some of the lines that I'm about to show you. They've almost never been tried in tournament practice. I think I found one game with one of these ideas. And all of these ideas were originally were created by a player that's passed away recently, a chess master by the name of Mohamed Tabakovic, who was a very strong Minnesota chess master. More importantly, he was very, very creative. He was an incredible attacking player. He came up with all kinds of amazing opening ideas. He would just play some of the most phenomenal sacrifices you've ever seen in your life. He was probably one of the more creative opening players I've ever seen. So I just want to give credit to Mohamed Tabakovic for coming up with these lines and showing them to me years and years ago. I've, of course, worked them out a little bit further on the computer, and now I'm going to share some of these variations with you. So the main part of this starts with the move bishop b5, and then there's several options that black can go with here at this point. Black can block that check with bishop d7. Black can, of course, block that check with knight on b to d7. And, of course, those are kind of the two. I want to say that those are basically the two main ones. We're going to see mostly bishop d7 and knight on b to d7 in this position. I have had people try the move pawn to c6 against me before. I wouldn't recommend this particular gambit. It doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. I don't think that you have an enormous amount of compensation for the material here. I think you can go ahead and just take the pawn, and I think white's pretty comfortable here. I don't think this is anything that white needs to worry about. I think we just play knight f3, we castle, we play d4, we continue to play chess. So, going back to these main lines, we have bishop d7 and knight on b to d7. So we're going to start with knight on b to d7. Now here I'm just going to recommend playing the standard approach. This was the move played by Anand in Anand versus Galigo. He played the move pawn to c4. That game continued a6. He simply captured on d7, bishop d7, then simply d4. That game continued b5, b3, just holding his center together. e6, he went ahead and took. He played d5 and gains the space. These are a lot of pawn moves, and this is something you do need to be a little bit nervous about when you play this position. There's a lot of guys that will play stuff very similar to this, and will also play a Portuguese variation where they'll sacrifice these center pawns to try to get a ton of activity. So you do have to be cautious about which positions you're willing to take this much space for so little development. But in this case, I think we can go ahead and trust Anand's opinion here. It seems like everything should work out just fine for white. White seems to have just enough time to consolidate, to get his pieces out, and he's using his tactics beautifully. And once he finally completely consolidates, he's just up the material cleanly here. And actually, black went ahead and resigned. This was a rapid event in 1993. So I think that's a very reasonable choice against knight on b to d7. I think we can play c4. We can follow in Anand's footsteps, and we can go ahead and hold that pawn. So the other option, of course, is bishop d7. And against this, I recommend the move bishop to c4. So there's basically two choices here. There's kind of the boring move bishop to g4, trying to just kind of turn this into something somewhat boring. Now, the assessment among strong players hasn't really changed that much since Fischer ran into this years ago. He played f3, his opponent played bishop f5, and Fischer just played the immediate pawn to g4, kicking that bishop again, and then after bishop c8 just continued with knight c3, knight on b to d7, played g5, kicking this knight. That was Fischer's whole point of playing g4. He wanted to play g5 and get the knight off of the d5 pawn, making it difficult for black to recover this pawn. And then after knight b6, he continues with bishop b5 check, knight fd7, he plays pawn to f4, knight takes d5, knight takes d5, pawn to c6, bishop c4, cd5, bishop d5, was major to decisive advantage white in Fischer versus Progressor in Monte Carlo in 1967. Now, the opinion of this position hasn't changed very much. Strong players have basically all tried variations of this g4 idea, with the idea of kicking this knight a move later. A lot of modern players will throw in the move knight c3 today. They'll wait for knight on b to d7, and then they'll insert the move g4. This is what Kirana did against Akopian in St. Louis in 2016. That game continued with knight b6, b3, and then bishop c8, bishop b2, knight takes, knight takes, knight takes, and then queen e2. And Kirana just had a nice, comfortable slight advantage that he was able to improve and eventually turn into a full point in Kirana versus Akopian in St. Louis in 2016. But this is slight edge white. We can just go ahead and show you the finish of that game. He just slowly improved his position on the king side, managed to exchange pieces, eventually broke through, and as you can see, Black's king is falling apart at this point, and White's position is huge. He could probably resign right here, but he played on a little bit further. And he finally gave up the ghost right here, as the bishop on b7 is pretty much dead, and there are no more checks that we can throw at our opponent. And that was Kirana versus Akopian in St. Louis, USA in 2016. So the assessment on those two positions hasn't changed very much. Grandmasters are invariably throwing in g4 with the idea of kicking in g5 at some point. They're either doing it after knight c3 or before knight c3. So another way you could, in theory, approach this is you could allow the capture on d5, although this is lesser played on the top levels because g4 is just, it's still working. Nobody's really found a way to deal with g4 effectively. But it is actually possible to just play a boring move here. You could even play knight on g to e2, and this should be slight edge white, although again, this is very little explored among top players because g4 is legit. So then you would just exchange, you would play d4, and you should have some sort of slight advantage here, mostly just in the fact that you've eliminated your c3 knight, so this should allow you to play c4 and f4 in combination with each other at some point. So for example, bishop g6, knight g3, bishop g6, and then we could just play c4 and f4, and this should be some sort of advantage for white in the middle of the board. This is a lesser explored idea. It's something that I kind of personally play around with from time to time, and I think that this is a pretty legitimate way to approach the white position. I don't think it's necessary to play g4, you know, just in case you want a place to put your king. If you want a castle kingside, this is basically the way to play it. In the other variation, you're pretty much committed to castling queenside because you've played pawn to g4, which is probably okay. You know, it's probably acceptable to castle queenside in that position anyway. So I don't think there's any reason to deviate from the path that Fischer showed us, and hasn't seemed to change very much. But this is another option that's available. So anyways, so if we go back, another idea here is the move pawn to b5, bishop b3, pawn to a5, and then you play pawn to a4, b takes a4, and I cannot bring myself to tell you to play the theoretical move here. I cannot bring myself to tell you to play the move bishop to c4. I can't do it. I honestly believe that the best move here was a move that was discovered by Mohamed Tavakovic. I forget exactly how long ago. I think it might have been as much as 20 years ago. And he never really got I don't know if he ever really got an opportunity to play this in a tournament game. I don't know exactly, but I do remember working out a lot of the theory with him in some coffee shops in Minnesota about 2 decades ago, along with Leonard Johnson helped him out with a lot of this prep work. And so I'm going to try to reconstruct some of this from memory, and I'm going to try to add, of course, my 2 cents with some of the home preparation with the computers. But the computers actually really like the move rook takes a4. They love this exchange sacrifice. They actually think it's the strongest move. So I'm hard pressed to recommend anything else. So I think you honestly should sacrifice this exchange. You should play rook takes ace4. I think it was the best move. I think this move deserves a lot more attention than what it's ever gotten. I think this is the best move in the position. So if they take this exchange, like if they play bishop takes a4, bishop takes a4, black has some huge weaknesses along these light squares. And actually these weaknesses are very interesting and they seem permanent. And it just seems like white just has a really simple advantage in all of these positions. So for starters, you have to ask yourself, how is black going to block this check? So we need to ask ourselves that question to begin with. So obviously he doesn't want to give up any more pawns. He doesn't want to play pawn to c6. One of these knights is going to be coming to the d7 square. It's going to be either knight f d7 or it's going to be knight on b to d7. So if knight on f to d7, we'll just start with that one. I want to give you, now the original computer, my computer shot out the move immediately. It wanted to play queen e2 and put pressure on e6. This actually prevents black from freeing himself with the move pawn to e6. This is kind of an interesting idea. And then after g6, it wants to chuck in queen e5, hitting that rook. And then after f6, it wants to play queen e6. And then after bishop h6, it wants to play knight e2, rook a6, shuffle that bishop back to h3 to gain the tempo, and then bring this knight into f4 and plop that bad boy down on e6. And this should probably advantage white. White's actually doing really well here. Just to give you a little bit more computer analysis here, stockfish playing stockfish, it would end up going something like this. And already this position is difficult to deal with for black. Black can't play king g7. He would have to play knight c6. We would put pressure in the middle of the board, and somehow this all works out for white in these kind of crazy lines. White would come out on top here after bishop to e8. So queen e2 is an option. It prevents the move pawn to e6, but I also think maybe the best move here is the move that Muhammad came up with 2 decades ago in this position, which is basically he thought that the only way that black could really free himself in this position was to try to engineer g6 and bishop g7, because there's really no other good way to develop the bishop. You can try to break out with pawn e6, but of course taking and then taking back with the f pawn, this isn't the world's greatest pawn structure to look at. So he just wanted to play b3, and actually after you go a few moves, the computer actually starts liking his move as much, if not better, than the move queen to e2. So I actually recommend you play this move. I actually recommend you play the move pawn to b3. This was his original idea. And then after g6, his basic idea is just play bishop b2, because now if we have rook g8, obviously black isn't castling. If we keep that king in the center, we've got the compensation. So the only other real option here is a move like pawn f6, and then we plop that queen down on e2. So it's essentially the same idea the computer's coming up with, but it's maybe a little bit more sophisticated, because we're not really worried about this breakout with pawn to e6, maybe the way the computer's more concerned about it. So then after, say, bishop g7, we would play bishop a3, which effectively prevents any kind of breakout from black. We're threatening the e7 square, we're threatening all kinds of stuff. So here the computer recommends f5, so again we're going with computer recommendations at this point. Knight f3, bishop f6, just trying to hold that e-pawn, and then each side would finally get an opportunity to castle, and you would think black would be relatively safe here, but this is a huge center, and these bishops are very well placed on these long diagonals, and this center is very imposing. And what's interesting about all these positions, and what's interesting about Muhammad's idea, is that it creates this long-term kind of bind in the position where black just has a very difficult time finishing the development of his pieces and getting his pieces into play. White has tons of compensation, not just positionally, but I mean also, materially. He's got the extra pawn for the exchange already, and his position is just getting better and better in the middle of the board. He's got that space. So knight b6 is an example, bishop b5. It's just hard to do anything here. You're stuck having to play these defensive moves, just knight c8 just to hold the e7 square. And then we can just build our position in the middle of the board, keep building. We can even exchange off some material. And this position is just nearly impossible to survive. We would go after the king. We would play knight e5, just continuing to improve, take back with the pawn, go after these dark squares. This is a really good moment to talk about light and dark square weaknesses, actually. Black is weak on both. He's weak on the light squares and he's weak on the dark squares. And this is huge because, yeah, black has an extra exchange in this position, but exchanges don't move diagonally. So this is actually a really big problem. You don't want to have light and dark squared weaknesses in a position where you don't have a light or dark squared bishop to defend them. And so basically this position should just be lost. So after, say, queen e6, we would take on c6, so that's hopeless. So it's hard to cover the weaknesses. We could try a move like rook e8, then we could simply play b4, and actually this is just to threaten to bring our bishop back to b3. So after we take, we could hit on f6, and we could play bishop b3, and I guess after bishop e7, we would just have to resign, because we can't cover the e6 square anymore. So this is kind of the crux of the whole idea of sacrificing the exchange. So if we go back, we take a look, okay, this is the idea behind knight fd7. We're going to play this early b3. What do we do if we play knight on b to d7? Now, there was actually one game that took place in Linares in 2018. I guarantee this was after Muhammad originally came up with the idea, but the person that played it as white, I got to give credit where credit is due. He might have come up with the idea independently. This was a Ladrón de Guevara Pinto versus Gomez Velasquez in Linares, Spain in 2018. They were both pretty high-rated players, too. The person playing the white pieces that came up with this idea was rated about 24-24, so he may have come up with this as idea on his own. But he played the move that we had looked at those 2 decades ago. He played the move knight f3, and then, of course, after, say, a move like g6, which wasn't played in the game. In the game, his game continued queen b8, which isn't really fighting back very much at all. It allows knight e5, queen b4, then c4. And he just got a great position. And black ended up castling queenside. And, of course, the queenside is just in shambles. And he just got his material back right away. And this just went really badly, really quickly for black. And white ended up winning after a few more moves. He's already kind of coming in really hard here. So black gave up the ghost here. He doesn't have a good move anymore. And white won that game. And like I said, that was Landra de Guevara Pinto against Velasquez Gomez and Linares in 2018. So queen b8's a lemon. So what other things could they try here? They could, of course, try g6, trying to, get their last piece into play. We would play knight to e5. Then they could continue their development with bishop g7. Now here we would play knight c6. And then this queen is put in an embarrassing situation. It doesn't have a great place to move. The only place it can really move is queen c8. And this kind of creates a funny situation. We're threatening mate on e7. And we would like to castle to get out of it. But of course that allows knight takes e7. And of course it's also interesting to note that we never defend the d5 pawn in this entire scenario. Now, the reason for that is after knight f3, if they were to take on d5, we would attack the knight would move back to f6, and then we would play queen f3, and we would be hitting the knight on d7 and the pawn on f7. And because we're hitting both the knight on d7 and the pawn on f7, our threat in this position is actually just to play the move bishop takes d7. So, for example, if black continued with the move pawn to g6, we would simply continue with the move bishop takes d7, knight takes d7, queen f7 mate. Of course, they could take with the queen and sacrifice their queen, but that position would be equally losing. So, we don't have this opportunity to play knight takes d5. And because we don't have this opportunity to play knight takes d5, this scenario here is going to be pretty much inevitable, where we play queen e2. And then we have the same type of scenario we had in the previous position, where we're going to have this opportunity to just simply hold this pawn with pawn to c4, build this big center, and black just kind of suffers back there. He doesn't really have a way to get his pieces out. So a sample variation would be something like queen e8. We would castle, knight c5. We don't want to exchange any of black's bad pieces, so we're just going to leave black with as many of them as we can. So black did something really smart there with knight c5, knight b3, knight takes c1. Of course, these are all stockfish recommendations. Queen d7, we're going to play rook back to e1, just hitting the e7 square. And then this position is nearly impossible to defend. They can't bring the rook to e8 because knight a5 would be winning. And if they just try to play like h5, I guess just trying to make this rook do something by pushing their pawn to h5, we can just bring this knight into the game nice and slow. We can play knight d2, bishop h6, and then actually the computer recommendation here is just to play knight takes e7 immediately, and this is supposedly already, because of all of the attacks going on, this is already just major advantage, actually decisive advantage white. So anyways, that is my full recommendation on exactly how you should face the move 3 knight f6. I recommend this bishop b5 check, and then against the main moves of bishop d7 followed by bishop g4, I recommend the old and tried f3 moves, and against knight on b to d7, I can recommend you to play Anand's pawn to c4 is pretty reasonable. Against bishop c4, b5, bishop b3, a5, a4, b takes a4, I recommend the novel approach of playing rook takes a4, and I believe that leads to a very comfortable advantage for white. Anyways, I hope you liked this video. I hope you learned something new about chess, and if you liked this content, and if you like some of my other content, please like and subscribe. Thank you very much for watching.